The Second World War, the historical lie. For decades, we have been constantly flooded with films, documentaries, and books about the Second World War. The images of bombed-out cities, battles, and human suffering are deeply and firmly anchored in our collective memory. Yet while we know these symptoms of the war in every detail, one fundamental question still remains unanswered. What was this war really about? To me personally, this constant focus and media presence of the World War has seemed increasingly strange in recent years. One might think people would want to forget this terrible time. Yet interestingly, it is constantly recalled. And despite all the reporting, films, and documentaries, it was ultimately never clear to me what this war was really about, what purpose it served. We see plenty of action and drama, but we don't become any wiser. It almost feels as if this media flood of World War content is a deliberate cover-up. People are kept busy with emotional stories and scenes of action so that they do not ask about the systematic changes. In public perception, the Second World War is often portrayed as a so-called good war, a fight against fascism, in which the Western democracies and the Soviet Union ultimately came together to defeat Hitler. But the common portrayal overlooks the long-term consequences of the war. The World War brought about far-reaching modernization both in the Western world and in the Soviet Union, and within a very short time it led to truly unprecedented advances in the automotive industry, aviation, electronics, communications, and nuclear technology. Developments that firmly cemented economic and military superiority over the rest of the world for many decades to come. One could even say that during the war years, the Western world and the Soviet Union went through an intense industrial and technological drastic cure. And finally, the Western world was also politically and structurally centralized and integrated. From fragmented nation-states emerged an integrated, centralized world order that still exists to this day. The crucial question is, were these profound transformations really just a natural consequence of the war, or were they, from the very beginning, the actual goal? What if the World War was not a tragic accident of history, but a deliberately staged event to transform the world? Were we witnesses to the greatest deception in modern history? Did millions die in a war whose true intention is still being concealed to this day? Was the war a means to an end for a far-reaching social and economic transformation? This documentary puts forward the thesis that the Second World War was not a historical accident, but was deliberately brought about and carefully and intentionally staged to achieve precisely this transformation of the world. A transformation that continues to shape and define global structures to this very day. In the following first chapter, we will look at the technological and industrial developments during the Second World War. The second chapter deals with the new institutional world order that emerged in the final years of the war and still exists to this day. Technological leaps in the Second World War. What really happened to the world between 1939 and 1945? Officially, nations were said to be fighting over territory, ideologies, and political dominance. Yet when we look more closely at the sweeping technological and industrial transformation of that entire period, another question indeed arises. Did the World War ultimately serve as an immense catalyst for an unprecedented modernization of Western industry itself? In 1914, armies still went to war with horse-drawn artillery and crude vehicles, little more than wagons with bolted-on engines. Aircraft were fragile wooden frames, and communication relied on field telephones and carrier pigeons. In 1945, the war ended with jet aircraft, rockets, radar, computers, and nuclear weapons, marking the dawn of the atomic age. Within just a few years, the technological landscape of the world had been completely transformed. This transformation was no accident. The World War forced entire nations into an unprecedented mobilization of their industrial and scientific resources. What began as a military necessity gradually evolved into a systematic reorganization of Western production capacities, a drastic industrial cure that laid the groundwork for the technological and economic dominance over the rest of the world. The crucial question is this: was this massive buildup of industry and technology merely a reaction to the circumstances of war, or was it part of a long-term plan for technological and economic dominance? Could it, in fact, have been about creating a systematic global superiority, not just between individual nations, but between the entire West and the Soviet Union and the rest of the world? Before the First World War, warfare was shaped largely by craft and mechanics. Handcrafted rifles, simple artillery, and cavalry dominated. Mass production was hardly common. Weapons were mostly produced regionally. Horses and ships were the main means of transport. Railways were slowly being added. Communication took place mainly through messengers and visual signals, supplemented by wired telegraphy to a limited extent. The First World War initiated a fundamental change. Industrial production increasingly determined military strength. Craft production gave way to the industrial mass production of military goods. The Second World War. The scientific and technological explosion. The Second World War was a war of science, in which technological development and research played central roles. It brought profound advances in aviation. Fighter planes like the British Spitfire and the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 set new standards for speed and agility. In the United States, the B-17 Flying Fortress was developed as a strategic long-range bomber for large-scale air raids during the war. By the very end of the war, a major technological leap followed. The Messerschmitt Me 262 became the very first operational jet aircraft ever used in combat, a clear harbinger of the coming jet age. The Second World War marked a decisive technological advance in tank development and ushered in a completely new phase of mechanized warfare. Technically advanced models like the Tiger I and the King Tiger stood as clear symbols of this leap. Massive, heavily armored combat vehicles with exceptional firepower and refined targeting optics. Radar was used for the very first time to detect aircraft and ships. Systems like Britain's Chain Home Network greatly improved air defense. Improved German submarines, such as the Type 7, initially dominated the Atlantic. Sonar and radar provided decisive countermeasures. The German V-2 rocket opened the rocket age and was a forerunner of space travel and intercontinental missiles. The Manhattan Project led to the development of the first atomic bombs. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the entry into the nuclear age. From that moment on, nuclear power became one of the most decisive technologies of the 20th century. Computers and cryptography. The first programmable computer, Colossus, was developed to decrypt German radio messages. It becomes clear that the Second World War drastically accelerated technological development. Industrial mass production replaced craft manufacturing. Factories became the centers of weapons production. Science and technology became crucial. Chemists, physicists, and engineers were as strategically important as generals. In wartime, nations are under extreme pressure of resources and time to be technologically superior, or at least to keep up. Researchers and engineering teams received enormous funding and strong political backing to deliver rapid solutions. Projects that in peacetime would have taken years or even decades were achieved within months or just a few years. A prime example of this was the Manhattan Project, where vast financial and human resources were concentrated, contributing decisively to the rapid development of nuclear physics and later nuclear energy. The global race for technology led to a convergence of standards. New generations of tanks consistently featured tracked drives, fully enclosed turrets, and radios. Aircraft became all-metal monoplanes with one or more engines and noticeably higher speed. Espionage, licensing agreements, and captured war material led to the adoption and copying of enemy technologies. Technical convergence was the result. All major powers deliberately invested in the expansion of their key industries. In metallurgy, high-strength steels and light metals like aluminum were processed on an unprecedented scale. Engine construction experienced a surge, from the traditional combustion engine through modern diesel systems to turbine technology. At the same time, vast production capacities emerged, with new factory facilities, streamlined assembly line work, and technically trained personnel. The Second World War acted as a catalyst for technological and scientific innovations, whose effects still endure today in areas such as vehicle manufacturing, aerospace, computers, communication technology, radar technology, and nuclear energy. Total mobilization of industry during the Second World War. The industrial expansion was enormous. Factories were converted, new production sites were built in record time, and civilian companies were integrated into military supply chains. In the United States, gigantic manufacturing complexes arose, some on undeveloped land, transferring modern assembly line work to war production. General Motors, Ford, and other corporations transformed into high-performance producers of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. In Germany and Britain, too, industry was massively expanded under state control, with centralized planning, forced labor, and technical standardization. With the outbreak of war, there was a complete shift to war production. Industry was drawn into the logic of war, directed, supported by propaganda, and radically intensified. USA, the arsenal of democracy. With the Lend-Lease Act of 1940, massive arms deliveries to Allied nations began. After Pearl Harbor in 1941, the War Production Board took control of industry. Under the Victory program, millions of weapons, vehicles, and rounds of ammunition were produced in the shortest time. The Ford plant at Willow Run built one B-24 Liberator per hour, a symbol of industrial war machinery. The Rosie the Riveter campaign targeted female workers. Millions of women worked in factories, replacing men who had gone to war, and kept the vital arms production running. Between 1942 and 1945, around 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and 6,000 warships were produced. Germany, the total war. Under Albert Speer as armaments minister, production was centralized, streamlined, and industrialized. Designs were simplified, production lines standardized. Millions of forced laborers were integrated into the armaments economy. Propaganda accompanied production. In 1943, Goebbels called for total war. In the Soviet Union, too, industry was completely converted to armaments as the war began. Under centralized state control, entire factories from the western parts of the country were dismantled and rebuilt east of the Urals to protect them from the German advance. Despite immense losses and destruction, the Soviet war economy produced millions of rifles, tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, with a strong focus on mass production, simple construction, and rugged functionality. Military innovation as the foundation of modern technology. Many technologies we take for granted today were originally created for military purposes. The demands of the World War led to developments that, after the war, were systematically transferred to civilian applications. Aviation. The development of powerful military aircraft during the Second World War paved the way for civilian passenger aviation. Civilian planes already in service, like the Douglas DC-3, were widely used during the war in a military version, the C-47, and after the war they played a decisive role in driving the expansion of civil air transport. Crucial for air defense and early warning during the Second World War, radar was after the war the basis for civilian air traffic control and meteorology. Computers. In the United States, the ENIAC emerged as one of the first electronic computers, designed to calculate ballistic trajectories for the military. Although it became operational shortly after the war ended, it laid the foundation for later digital infrastructure, just like the British Colossus, which decrypted German radio messages. Nuclear energy. The Manhattan Project led not only to the atomic bomb, but also to the civilian use of nuclear energy. Synthetic materials. Substances like nylon and plexiglass were developed during the war and later widely used in fashion and consumer goods industries. The myth of Reconstruction. After the Second World War, the rebuilding of Germany and Western Europe was often portrayed as a success story, an economic miracle born of hard work, sacrifice, and initiative. In the United States, too, the idea took hold that the Western democracies had rebuilt themselves through their own strength, while authoritarian states had economically fallen behind. In the United States, the prevailing notion is that the country rose to economic leadership after the war thanks to its pioneering spirit, democracy, and the free market. Far less discussed is the fact that the U.S. maintained a highly industrialized war economy and, after the war, deliberately shifted it toward export. Many historians and economists argue that the foundations of Reconstruction were not laid in the post-war years, but during the war itself. The technological and industrial lead of Western Europe and the United States was, to a large extent, built on wartime investments and innovations. The war economy left behind a highly capable infrastructure that, after the war, could be redirected toward the production of consumer goods. America's economic growth after 1945 still relied heavily on the preservation of its military production structures. The arms economy ensured full employment, generated major investments in technology and infrastructure, and preserved an industrial base that continued well beyond 1945. Conclusion. The Reconstruction after the Second World War was not simply a success story built on its own, but relied heavily on structures created during the war. Industrial capacity, the organization of the arms economy, and technological knowledge formed the basis for the economic restart. From war industry to export dominance. After the Second World War, the United States, Britain, France, and increasingly West Germany possessed enormous industrial capacities. These had been massively built up during the war to produce millions of tanks, aircraft, ships, weapons, and ammunition. These production capacities created during the war were not dismantled after 1945, but converted to civilian goods. They became one of the key foundations for the economic upswing and the broad technological modernization throughout the Western world. Numerous industrial companies were expanded technologically, logistically, and organizationally by the wartime economy. General Motors had produced, among other things, tanks and engines during the war and greatly expanded its production, a capacity from which civilian vehicle manufacturing directly profited after the war. Ford, in its Willow Run plant, had built one B-24 bomber per hour, an industrial achievement of unprecedented scale, and after 1945, converted that capacity to mass production of passenger cars. General Electric, which had supplied the Army with radio equipment, electrical systems, and radar, now focused on consumer and household electronics. Boeing expanded its expertise in military transport and bomber aircraft and, in the decades that followed, rose to become the world's leading manufacturer of civilian airliners. In Germany as well, industry was shifted to civilian production. Volkswagen, originally founded for the KDF car, a people's car planned by the Nazi regime, quickly resumed series production under British supervision. In the 1950s, the VW Beetle became an icon of the West German economic miracle and a global export success. BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Opel made use of their expanded production capacities after the war for civilian car manufacturing. Siemens relied on its experience in producing electronic military equipment and grew into a world leader in electrical engineering. The chemical conglomerate IG Farben was broken up after the war into BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, but all three companies built on their wartime production and achieved a dominant position in the global chemical and pharmaceutical industries. All of these companies were massively developed during the war, technologically, logistically, and organizationally. After 1945, they took on central roles in the Western export economy. Their existing factories, machinery, logistics networks, and management structures continued seamlessly. Only the production goal changed. The thesis of the drastic cure of the Western world. The Western states went through a drastic industrial cure in the 1940s, a forced transformation driven by total war in which entire societies were shifted to maximum production. During the war, entire industries were centrally coordinated. Production processes were geared toward mass manufacturing. New technologies were developed and implemented under intense pressure. Production volumes and speeds rose to unprecedented levels. This created, within just a few years, industrial capacity and know-how that would have taken decades under peacetime conditions. After the war, the massive production capacities were shifted to civilian output. Military aircraft factories became sites for civilian production. Vehicle plants switched from tanks to cars. Electronics and communications technology flowed into consumer products. Logistical and organizational structures were simply kept in place. The war was the means to create a new world, not by accident, but by design. After the war, the Western industrial nations were ready to dominate the world markets. The Western world as a global export power. The Western countries went on to dominate the global market with high-quality industrial goods, vehicles, and technology. This dominance was the result of deliberate transformation processes, not just mere competitiveness. The Western world entered the civilian export market with a wartime-driven, highly developed industrial infrastructure, with production capacities that were unmatched anywhere in the world. Many of the technologies developed during the war were placed under strict patent protection after 1945, creating a double effect. Western companies were now able to export their products all over the world. Companies in Africa, Asia, or Latin America had no access to this knowledge and remained heavily dependent on imports. This control of patents became one of the key mechanisms to safeguard the technological lead and to prevent others from ever catching up. At the same time, the Global South was systematically pushed into the role of raw material supplier and sales market. Former colonies were turned into economic dependencies. Development loans were tied to Western companies, products, and standards. Independent industrialization initiatives were slowed down or redirected. Examples can be found in India, Egypt, and Ghana, where local attempts at industrialization were blocked or steered in certain directions by the conditions imposed by the World Bank and the IMF. This new world order was stabilized by international institutions. GATT, from 1947, promoted the removal of tariffs and trade barriers, a move that mainly benefited Western industrial exporters. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank controlled capital flows and often tied infrastructure investments to Western suppliers. These structural pillars allowed a managed globalization under Western dominance. Conclusion: the long-term strategy behind the economic rise. The thesis that the Western nations were subjected to a drastic cure through war to massively expand their industries and achieve global dominance is supported by historical facts. The United States and Western Europe built up a highly industrialized production base during the war, a base that, after 1945, was not dismantled but deliberately redirected towards civilian exports. The Western world entered the civilian export market with a war-driven, highly advanced industrial infrastructure, carrying production capacities that truly had no equal anywhere else in the world. Africa, Asia, and Latin America, in turn, largely became markets for Western goods, without ever being granted access to the most modern technology. Many of today's leading global industrial companies, including GM, Ford, VW, and Siemens, gained enormously from the post-war conversion of wartime production capacities into civilian export goods after the Second World War. The industrial infrastructure built during the conflict, along with the accumulated technical know-how and significant government support, allowed them to recover rapidly and to expand into international markets. The Western world underwent a forced industrial transformation through the war, which in the long run led to global economic and technological dominance. The industrial restructuring brought about by the Second World War led to a global export order in which the Western world systematically expanded and institutionally secured its technological and economic dominance, an order whose basic structures remain in place to this day. When we speak of technology and industry, we should not forget the long-term military significance of the technological leaps made during the Second World War. The Second World War pushed humanity into a new era, and nothing symbolizes that more powerfully than the atomic bomb. Developed in the secret Manhattan Project, it was far more than just a weapon. It marked a military turning point that revolutionized warfare and permanently altered the global balance of power. In 1942, the Manhattan Project began under General Leslie Groves and J. Robert Oppenheimer. With a budget of $2 billion, today about 30 to 40 billion, it brought together thousands of scientists at sites like Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. In just 3 years, it mobilized resources that would otherwise have taken decades. The war became the decisive driver. Fear of a German atomic program pushed the creation of a military superweapon meant to end the conflict swiftly and decisively. Even though the German effort collapsed, that threat justified the urgency. The goal was simple: to forge a strategic weapon that would give the United States clear superiority. The atomic bomb was not only an instrument of destruction, it marked the dawn of the nuclear age. It did lay the groundwork for civilian nuclear power, yet its true meaning lay in its military dimension. In 1945, it showed the world the power to wipe out entire cities with a single blast. It was not merely a scientific breakthrough, but a tool of military dominance that irreversibly changed the nature of warfare and firmly positioned the United States as the leading power. The Manhattan Project drove innovations in nuclear physics, computer technology, industrial production, and engineering, advances that extended well beyond the bomb itself. With the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the United States ended the war and clearly showed a military superiority that made them a superpower. One bomb alone could wipe out cities and reshape the balance of world power. Until 1949, when the first Soviet nuclear test took place, America held a nuclear monopoly that shaped the post-war order. The atomic bomb became a symbol and instrument of military deterrence, allowing the United States to project its power worldwide. Nations without nuclear weapons were pushed down the global hierarchy, dependent on superpowers like the United States, and later the Soviet Union. Conclusion: Technology and Industry in World War II. The Second World War was more than just a massive military event. It was a historical turning point in which the Western world underwent an industrial and technological drastic cure and an unprecedented wave of modernization. This change cemented its technological and economic superiority over the rest of the world for decades to come. In the face of the war, technological innovations were pushed forward, industrial production capacities were radically expanded, and entire societies were shifted toward armaments production. This wartime infrastructure formed the essential basis for the Western nations' worldwide economic dominance in the years after the war. The Western world dominated the global export market through technological superiority, and the industrial capacities expanded during the war. This Western dominance was not the product of spontaneous innovation or free market forces, but the result of a planned, war-driven transformation that continues to shape the world today. For all the focus on civilian industrial and technological dominance, one crucial aspect must not be overlooked. The technological and industrial transformation did not apply only to civilian uses. The massive military innovations of the Second World War, above all nuclear weapons, but also rocket technology, modern tanks, long-range bombers, and jet aircraft, laid the foundation for the long-term military dominance of the Western powers, including the Soviet Union, over the rest of the world. These military achievements carried seamlessly into the post-war era and were strategically expanded during the Cold War. It was here, in the military realm, that it became most strikingly clear how fully the Second World War had created a technological platform whose strategic value was secured for decades. We will return to this development and its lasting significance later in the chapter on the Cold War. Integration and consolidation: the emergence of a new world order. World history is usually portrayed as a long series of conflicts, with nations struggling and fighting for power, for territories, or at times driven by ideology. But what if this well-established perspective only barely scratches the surface? When one carefully looks at the geopolitical structures before and after the World War, an alternative thesis becomes clear. The war may, in fact, have been deliberately used to consolidate the Western world, and to integrate it under a single, centralized control. Before the First World War, the Western world was marked by fragmentation and rivalry. The Western world was divided into nation-states, each driven by imperial ambitions. The British Empire, the German Empire, and the French colonial realm stood in constant rivalry with one another. There was barely any coordinated effort in the economy or technology. Shared industrial networks simply did not exist, and supranational cooperation was rare. International trade operated under the gold standard, yet there was no central economic steering as we know it today through the European Union or the World Trade Organization. Political instability was significant. Alliance systems created opposing blocs among the great powers, but they never resulted in true economic integration. The interwar period, from 1918 to 1939. Despite the founding of the League of Nations in 1920, international relations remained marked by instability. Europe was economically devastated, while the United States rose to become the leading global economic power. Yet genuine international cooperation still did not exist. The economic crisis of 1929 even deepened the isolation of the individual countries. Germany remained isolated by the Treaty of Versailles, while the United States largely stayed out of European affairs. There were no supranational organizations like those that would emerge after the Second World War. This makes it clear, despite the devastating experience of the First World War, there was no substantial integration of the Western world. The situation after the Second World War presents a striking contrast. Within just a few years, a complex network of international organizations and alliances emerged, gradually uniting the Western world under American leadership. In only 5 years after the end of the war, significantly more major international organizations were created than in the entire 150 years before. In 1945, the United Nations was founded with the mission to firmly safeguard world peace. In 1949, the Council of Europe followed, aimed at promoting democracy and protecting human rights across Europe. In 1944, the Bretton Woods system was created with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The IMF closely oversaw the international monetary system, while the World Bank took on the task of financing vital development projects. In 1948, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation was founded to coordinate the Marshall Plan. That massive program ran from 1948 to 52, organizing and directing the US-backed reconstruction of Europe. In 1947, GATT established basic trade rules for the Western markets, laying down the foundation for decades of commerce. In 1949, NATO was founded as a military defense alliance. Was this integration an intended goal of the war? Before the war, the Western world was fragmented. Afterward, it was integrated. The war made it possible to break down national resistance and to install global structures. Economic and technological control was centralized through supranational organizations. The World War was not merely the result of geopolitical rivalries, but a deliberately used, or even carefully staged, event intended and designed to destroy old political and social orders, and to replace them with a new, centrally organized social structure. The Cold War as an instrument of consolidation. The Second World War destroyed the old, fragmented world order and created the basis for a new Western integration. Before 1939, the Western world was shaped by national rivalries and imperialist competitions. There were no supranational structures, no US-led alliances, and no coordinated economic policy among the great powers. In 1945, Europe lay in ruins. This destruction created an emergency that allowed the United States to step in as a savior and impose its own conditions for reconstruction. The traumatic experiences of war, fascism, and total destruction were deliberately used as arguments for a new, centralized order. Through multilateral cooperation and economic interconnection, the disasters of the past were meant to be prevented. The emerging Cold War solidified the new order and provided the justification for a lasting Western integration under US leadership. After 1945, there suddenly existed a shared external threat from the Soviet Union, which made close Western cooperation seem absolutely essential and existentially necessary. Between 1945 and 1950, a close political, economic, and military interconnection of Western Europe emerged under US leadership, an integration that had never existed in this form before. The Cold War ensured that this new order did not remain merely temporary, but instead solidified over the course of decades. The external threat from the Soviet Union legitimized US dominance and prevented European countries from returning to true national independence. The crucial question: was it coincidence or a plan? Either Western integration was a natural reaction to the experiences of the war and the Soviet threat, and the United States opportunistically seized the opportunity that presented itself. Or it was a deliberate plan, and the Second World War served as the chosen means to destroy the old world order and to carefully establish a new, US-centered one. The Cold War then became the key instrument used to permanently legitimize this new order. The striking systematic nature and the very speed with which the new order was established rather suggest a deliberate plan. Before the war, a fragmented Western world with no central steering. The Second World War, destruction of the old order and the weakening of the European powers. After the war, rapid establishment of a US-centered system of international institutions. Cold War. An external threat legitimized this new order for decades. The Second World War, from this perspective, appears not only as a conflict over territories and ideologies, but as a transformative and truly defining event that made possible a new, centralized world order, one that was no longer based primarily on territorial control, but instead on economic, technological, and institutional dominance. The traumatic experiences of war and destruction were explicitly used as a warning to underline the urgency of a centralized and cooperative world order. The new political, economic, and military structures were meant to prevent future wars, secure stability, and lead the Western world into a cooperative, rules-based order. Many of the newly founded institutions explicitly referred in their founding documents to the experiences of the Second World War as both a historical warning and the central justification for their very creation. Without the Second World War, it would have been highly unlikely for the Western countries to ever voluntarily join a US-led order. The Cold War then ensured that this new order would remain firmly in place for the long term. While official history tends to focus on strategies, battles, and political decisions, one central perspective remains in the shadows: the perspective of ordinary people. The population has always been the one that suffered most from these historical processes. While elites pursued their strategic goals, it was the people in the streets who faced the real consequences: death, hunger, loss, and then the hardship of rebuilding. Before every major war, there was massive public resistance. First World War. Before 1914, the public in most countries showed little desire for war. Labor movements and socialists warned of a fratricidal war among ordinary people. But within just a few months, public sentiment shifted, nationalism flared up, and people were drawn into war. Weeks of war propaganda gradually turned the enemy into a monster. The myth of German soldiers spearing Belgian babies was widely spread, a calculated lie used to mobilize for war. Second World War. After the horrors of the First World War, pacifism had become widespread across Europe. In the 1930s, as many as 95% of Americans opposed getting involved in European conflicts. In both France and Britain, the willingness to go to war was initially very low. Roosevelt had promised to keep the United States entirely out of the war. Then came Pearl Harbor, a partly provoked and highly publicized attack, and the public mood shifted dramatically. Whether Pearl Harbor in 1941 or the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. In many cases, these were staged or exaggerated events meant to break the resistance of the people. During the Cold War, the population was trained for decades to fear the enemy. Some hated the communist world conspiracy, others the capitalist imperialism. After every war, it was not the politicians, but the ordinary people who rebuilt everything in the end. After 1918, many men were dead or maimed, and women had to take over the work and feed their families alone. After 45, the rubble women cleared the destroyed cities, while the United States used the Marshall Plan for political control. The history of major wars and geopolitical maneuvers is also the history of entire populations being instrumentalized. They were lied to, made to accept wars they never wanted. They were killed in conflicts that served the interests of others. They had to rebuild what others had destroyed. They carried the burden, often across generations. Conclusion: Second World War. The historical lie. At the beginning of this documentary, we asked what the Second World War was actually supposed to accomplish. The answer to this question may emerge in the pattern that becomes visible when we look at historical developments through the lens of our formulated theses. The Western world and the Soviet Union, or to put it even more clearly, the entire white world, went through an intense industrial and technological crash course. This truly unprecedented modernization firmly cemented their technological and economic dominance over the rest of the world for many decades to come. The Second World War was a significant period of technological innovation, rapidly accelerated by the pressing demands of the conflict. The technologies, industrial capacities, and production methods developed during the war ultimately had a very beneficial long-term side effect for our world. After the war, they were transferred into the civilian economy and laid the foundation for global export dominance. However, the long-term strategic importance of the military innovations from the Second World War must not be overlooked. These innovations not only created military superiority during the war itself, but also served after the war as a technological platform for sustained military dominance of both the West and the Soviet Union over the rest of the world. The arms buildup during the war laid a highly advanced technical and industrial base. This base was further developed after the war in the following Cold War, whose dynamics we will analyze in the next chapter. At the same time, a political and structural unification of the Western world took place. Sovereign nation-states gave way to a rules-based order shaped and maintained by international organizations, supported by military, economic, and institutional leadership structures. It appears as if the chaos caused by the war was deliberately used to enforce this new global architecture. The White World was thus prepared for a new global era. Meanwhile, in the East, a second independent power bloc emerged under the leadership of the Soviet Union. The Eastern and Western blocs together formed a new bipolar post-war order. This brings us to the crucial question: were we witnesses to the greatest deception in modern history? Did millions die in a war whose true purpose remains hidden to this day? Personally, I believe that this is exactly the case. The World War was used as an instrument to carry out a deliberate plan. The White World was rapidly upgraded technologically, industrially, and militarily within a short period. And under the umbrella of international organizations, a new world order emerged. Of course, it is very difficult to conclusively prove our suspicions. We have no clear, irrefutable documents available that would definitively demonstrate the World War was a deliberate means to an end. Such documents will most likely never be accessible to ordinary people like us. But when we look back over the past several decades, at the time of the World War and later the Cold War, a full and clear picture emerges that makes our theses appear quite realistic. When taking a broad macro perspective, without getting lost in details such as battles, death, and destruction, a picture emerges that, in hindsight, appears quite suspicious. If we consider this accumulation of technological, industrial, and societal changes and become fully aware of the significant long-term benefits they brought to our world, it leads us to suspect that these changes did not arise merely as a spontaneous reaction to the war, but were deliberately and carefully planned. Perhaps in the end, it is only a feeling, and the final proof for our theses is lacking. But not all feelings deceive, and one does not always need clear evidence in hand to know that something is wrong, and perhaps has been for a very long time. This documentary offers a new perspective on the Second World War and the important question of what purpose it truly served. A perspective that may be closer to the truth than any other explanation offered so far. Making this documentary took several months of intensive full-time work. If it moved you or you learned something new, please consider supporting my work. I can then continue this project and produce additional parts. Otherwise, I simply won't be able to continue. I'd be incredibly grateful for any donation, big or small. I fully expect this to get shadow banned to limit the reach of this content. Please like, subscribe, and share the video. That helps me maintain visibility even under shadow banning.